If any, or more likely all of the clips I'm about to play for you trigger a flood, a deluge, a tsunami of nostalgia, you just might be a member of the Amadeus generation.
Leave me alone.
Why don't I have 3 heads?
And for those of you who don't immediately get swept away,
Is there a part in there for me?
maybe you've never seen this movie, maybe you passed on it.
Too many notes. Mock me, laugh!
Either way, all of you should stick around to find out how a period film that few expected to succeed at the box office
I'm a vulgar man.
went on to sweep the 1985 Oscars
Well, look at them.
and become a cultural touchstone for the emerging classical nerds of the in-between generation, which happens to be my generation, Generation X.
It's all right here in my noodle.
I watched Amadeus at your run-of-the-mill mall movie theater when I was 11, and let me tell you, I was stunned, riveted from beginning to end, and I went back at least twice to see it in the theater, and of course, later rented it at Blockbuster. And then I copied it once I figured out how to daisy-chain video cassette players, and then I bought the DVD, and then the 2002 director's cut when it was released on DVD in 2010, and then I ripped... I've carried Amadeus in the hobo bindle of my life for almost 40 years, and I have strong feelings about it. But then again, I think most people who watched Amadeus thought it was a masterful film, even if they were annoyed with the fictionalization of the Mozart-Salieri rivalry or Tom Hulce's cackle. When it swept the Oscars in 1985, absent were the usual grumbles of dissent or controversy. Consensus is quite rare in Hollywood, but a huge majority seem to agree. Amadeus was a masterpiece.
And the winner for this is Amadeus.
But for a small subset of young, impressionable classical nerds, it was more than that. For many of us, it elevated what was an after-school preoccupation, and sometimes a chore, into a lifelong pursuit and a passion. It tuned our ears to listen to music differently, and it gave us language to use when talking about it. So based on your reaction to the clips earlier, you likely already know if you're one of us. Putting a finer point on it, if you're still watching this here video, you probably are. And I rather highly suspect that you're a Gen Xer, which means you were born between 1965 and 1980. If you're not, and you're still here, just trust me and put Amadeus on your watch list right now. It's available to rent or buy in all the usual places, Prime, Google Play, Apple TV. Spend the $5 and you're gonna love it. I'm personally partial to the original 1984 version, but the director's cut is interesting, and hey, it has everything. If you care to know what scenes were added, I've added a link below to a site that has the timestamps of all the additional footage. And while you're down there, perhaps consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Back to the topic at hand. At first glance, Amadeus might not seem to be a very Gen X film. It wasn't on any of the top Gen X movie lists I found, and there are many, which of course include the likes of The Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, movies that are indeed central to the Gen X identity. Whether intentional or not, the creators of Amadeus hit on some very Gen X-y themes, in particular a rejection of formality and disrespect for authority. The rebellious teens in The Breakfast Club challenged the stereotypes and social structures of high school.
The next screw that falls out is gonna be you.
Ferris Bueller epitomizes the carefree, rule-breaking spirit of youth.
How could I possibly be expected to handle school on a day like this?
Less obvious to me, at least until I started thinking about this video, was Tom Hulce's Mozart. Who is absolutely over the top, maybe closer to Pee Wee Herman, also 1985. Tom Hulce's Mozart defies the staid conventions of the classical music establishment.
If His Grace is not satisfied with me, he can dismiss me. People so lofty, they sound as if they shit marble.
And his father's intrusiveness and desire to manage his son's life and career.
They say you have debts.
It's also a very dark film, which opens with an attempted suicide and has anything but a happy ending. But it did have a PG rating, which meant that nerdy classical music kids in the under 16 crowd could watch it at theaters without any friction. Note the 2002 director's cut had an R rating due to a scene that was removed from the 1984 release, in which Constanza visits Salieri in secret and briefly exposes her breasts. Anywho, the point being that more younger Gen X teens of a certain ilk, think the hordes of middle school, high school band, orchestra, and choir kids, more of those kids watched it during their most impressionable learning years. And it's also probable that most of us were interested in seeing Amadeus simply because we were playing Mozart. His music is all over the middle and high school student level repertoire, and to see a movie about him was pretty neat. Speaking of repertoire, many of you will know that Mozart wrote a lot of music in his very short life. So there was plenty of music to choose from, and the filmmakers here did just an incredible job curating the soundtrack and a masterful job editing to it. Again, this is a dark story, which means it's superbly positioned to make good use of Mozart's music at its finest. The best Mozart is minor mode Mozart. There's a great quote. I thought it was by Alfred Brendel, but I couldn't find it for this video. It says something to the effect of, while Mozart wrote the vast majority of his music in major keys, his minor mode compositions, though far fewer, vastly outweigh the rest. My personal opinion is that Mozart's works written in minor keys are unsurpassed in their ability to evoke, to summon pure human tragedy. Poor tortured Mozart. Dang it. To start with the elephant in the room, the Requiem, of course, features prominently in Amadeus' fictionalized storyline and dominates the narrative in the latter portion of the film. The other excerpts, the so-called Don Giovanni chords, are used to great effect throughout, but notably at the very beginning of the film against a black screen. D minor is the key in which Salieri hatches his plot, from the opening Sinfonia of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 20 to the Don Giovanni chord as he appears in disguise at Mozart's door, to the opening bars of the Requiem as the commission is silently accepted.
Work fast, and be sure tell no one what you do.
Conveniently, nothing had to be transposed for the film. The Confutatis section of the Requiem is used in a particularly unforgettable sequence. You Amadeus generation folks know of which I speak. The music drives the drama of Constanza rushing back to Vienna, which is just a pitch-perfect accompaniment to the train of horses galloping at dusk. Beautifully juxtaposed with the voce me of Mozart singing in ever-weakening falsetto. There's so many examples of great editing in this film, and I would personally love to hear which are your favorite moments. So leave me a comment. So if you were like me, you were probably unreasonably excited about the Amadeus soundtrack when it was released on CD, and you waited for it to hit the shelves at your local music store, which back then, remember, they often had quaint little classical sections. And then you listened to it over and over and over again. And then you probably bought more CDs of Mozart and or other classical music. I personally moved on to obsess over Russian composers. For you, maybe it was Beethoven or Chopin, or some other composer whose life inevitably ended in impoverished tragedy. Amadeus was a pretty powerful gateway drug. Like, if there was a local opera company or a university with a music department in your city that mounted a production of a Mozart opera, you were probably there. Same goes for Mozart symphonies or concerti. If they were on your local orchestra's concert program, which they happened to be more frequently after 1984, you probably were in the audience. If you were a pianist, you probably had to learn Concerto No. 20 because it was the high school competition piece until at least the early 90s. But if you were a violinist, not much changed since you were all playing Mozart concerti in high school before 1984. I'm looking at you, G major. Anyway, it was a bit of a craze, the likes of which the classical music world hadn't seen before, and frankly hasn't since. Most classical music nerds have heard or used this quote at some point in our lives. So let's say it together. Where words end, music begins. For anyone who's had to write or speak about, to describe music, you will have come to understand that it's a uniquely hard thing to do. For those of us in the Amadeus generation, there's one very special scene where Salieri does a really fine job of this. You know the one.
An oboe.
What's noteworthy is the absence of any sort of academic analysis, which is always such an awful buzzkilly thing to endure. Instead, he describes using analogies.
Like a rusty squeeze box.
I had a music theory professor who made a point of steering students away from spending a lot of pages writing about analysis. This chord leads to that chord, and instead asked us to focus on describing how music makes us feel. Which is the more difficult assignment by far, because you're dealing with pure subjectivities. But also, if done well, it's infinitely more interesting and persuasive. Then there's the scene with Mozart pleading his case for the marriage of Figaro at the Emperor's Court, where he draws the distinction between music and the spoken voice.
With music, you can have 20 individuals all talking at the same time, and it's not noise, it's a perfect harmony.
Look, he goes a little over his skis here. I mean, it's a movie, but at a certain point, even music breaks down when too much is going on. But this idea was new to me when I was a wee lad, and it stuck with me. Okay, last one. It's somewhat ironic that arguably the most annoying scene in Amadeus was probably your first, or for some of you, maybe the only score analysis session you ever experienced in your life.
Now the tenors. Fourth beat of the first measure on C.
Here's what I wish to say. Look into my eyes. I know that it is hard to get past the sheer and utter implausibility of this scene. Near the end of the movie, with Mozart on his deathbed, dictating the Requiem to Salieri. It is absolutely ridiculous. But if you were young when you saw it, a mere hatchling musician, didn't it open your eyes to the magical world of score analysis? Down the road, did you look at musical scores differently? Did you mentally deconstruct them into component parts in order to understand how they were put together? I'll bet you did. Okay, folks, that's enough of me rambling. For those of you now self-identifying as members of the Amadeus generation, go watch it again if it's been a while, and let me know how you think it holds up after 40 years. For all the Amadeus virgins still watching, thanks for hanging in there, and I hope you'll give it a watch. Hell, why not make an evening of it? Throw some Orville Redenbacher in the microwave, and let me know what you think. Ciao.